Welcome to the Workers' Party podcast with Joti. So welcome everybody to this episode of the Workers' Party podcast. We're here today with a fantastic panel of trade unionists and we're going to have a really good discussion, I hope, about what is it that the trade unions need to learn in order to go forward into the coming period. What can we learn from the period that we've gone through recently? So before we get into our discussion, I'm going to introduce you to our panel here. We have Paul Embery, well known, I'm sure, to all of our viewers. He's a firefighter, a trade union activist, a columnist with Unheard, and the author of a book called Despised: Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class. And we could have a whole discussion just on the title of that book, I think. Then we have with us two of our Workers' Party activists. There's Jason Turvey, who's a trade union rep, an activist and a former executive committee member. And John Larkin, who is a bus driver and trade union activist. So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, we in the Workers' Party consider trade union work and organisation to be of paramount importance to the working class. And to our ability to defend our interests and to organise ourselves, to use the strength that we have in our numbers. But it's very noticeable that we've been through a period of probably 4 decades almost of what I would call defeat and retreat. You know, the ruling class has really been on the offensive in the recent period, both at home and internationally. And certainly here at home, it feels like they've had things almost entirely their own way. And I really would like to start by asking, and I'll throw this open to Paul first, is there one key lesson that you would take from this period about what we as a class have got wrong, or what our unions in particular have got wrong? You know, why do you think it is that we've failed so badly to resist the attacks of the capitalist class in the recent years?
Well, I think there are probably of contributory factors to that. I mean, one, I think, significant failing of the trade union movement, which I think has added and contributed to the increasing and the sad irrelevance in many respects of trade unions, is the total retreat from the trade union movement from the private sector. I mean, it seems to me, and I did some research on this from a book, that the trade union movement has largely retreated to its public sector comfort zone. Now, in many respects, I mean, I work in the public sector myself. I'm very, very pleased that the trade union movement is more strongly represented in the public sector. But it seems to me that there's no strategy for reunionising, if you like, vast swathes of the private sector, which are now completely ununionised. And I think that's had a huge impact both on the general success and effectiveness of the trade union movement, and much more importantly, the impact on workers who often work in precarious and transient employment without union protection. Now, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why that's happened. I mean, deindustrialisation, which, you know, began in earnest in many respects in the 1980s, the anti-trade union legislation, which has made it harder to unionise. You know, it's not entirely the trade union movement's fault, but equally, it is to a certain degree self-inflicted. And we've got a situation, I think, now where in many respects the trade union movement has become the voice of the London liberal class, and huge parts of provincial, small-town, post-industrial Britain, particularly, as I said, in the private sector, are just not represented. And that, for me, if I had a magic wand and I was in charge of the trade union movement, I would work day and night to implement a strategy to reunionise vast parts of the public sector, call centres, the gig economy, these places where workers are crying out for trade unions, but trade unions are just absent.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. I want to throw it open to you guys. Jason.
Well, I have to agree entirely with what Paul said. The retreat of the trade unions from the private sector has stymied the trade union movement's effectiveness, because if you look at the key difference between workers who work in the private sector and the workers who work in the public sector is that workers in the private sector have more hands on the levers of economic power than the ones in the public sector, which means that they are able, if they were unionised properly, to win real gains for their members in terms of pay, conditions, and so on. But one of the other mistakes, just to lead on from that, one of the other mistakes that I think the trade union movement has made in the last 35 odd years, probably since the end of the miners' strike, which was a pivotal moment, obviously, for the trade union movement, is there's been a drift away from class consciousness in the trade union movement. So, and something we've talked about on our trade union group, trade unions used to organise weekend schools. They would book hotels, get reps and activists to come along, and they would talk about class and where they fit in the class structure. Where we are now, we're at a point where, and I have recent experience of this. I was on a training course, and one of the colleagues on the training course was asked a question: what are the factors that by which you could be discriminated? And people went through the fairly obvious ones like race and religion and things like that. And then one person thought he'd throw a curveball and said, class. I think people can be discriminated against because of their class. And the person facilitating the course said, oh, that's a classic view. Like it's some fusty old-fashioned view that people don't tend to have anymore. And I think it's that lack of class consciousness and the lack of imbibing that class consciousness in people as a stepping stone towards developing a working class political consciousness is somewhere where the trade union movement has really let itself down. And it's created a vacuum where identity politics has filled that void. And I think it's a very destructive, false identity politics. I don't think it does anyone in the trade union movement any favours to imbibe that. But that would be, for me, that's the key mistake that the trade unions have made.
Thanks, Jason. How about you, John?
I think a few things. I agree with everything that Paul and Jason have said. I think in a more general sense, I think there's not very much collective and joined up thinking and action in terms of disputes. So, you know, for instance, if, you know, when the trains are on strike, there's no kind of, you know, train drivers in Scotland wouldn't be kind of taking action at the same. And obviously I know there's, you know, there's all kinds of legal reasons for that. But I think the bigger picture is, I mean, I think Paul touched on it there, you know, the kind of the shift from, I mean, and Jason as well, you know, the shift from kind of class consciousness, you know, it's not so much the, you know, the death of the unions, obviously from, you know, from Thatcher and the anti-union legislation, that coincided with, you know, a kind of the unions and the left kind of looking towards, you know, institutions like the European Union, for instance, as like a, you know, a beacon of sort of hope. And I think that's where they've gone wrong. So yeah, and I think, you know, from that, I think workers themselves now feel, as Paul said, that, you know, these union leaders, I mean, we know who they are, we know their names, and we know, you know, kind of what union they're for. But you go into work, or, you know, Paul speaks to his colleagues at work, or Jason, or myself, you know, most people don't know who these trade union leaders are. And in fact, you wouldn't recognise them if you walked past them in the street. And I think the last, I mean, for me, obviously, you know, being a bit younger, you know, I don't remember the heady days, but for me, the biggest, I mean, the biggest influence on me was probably Bob Crow. You know, big personality, and everyone, I mean, everyone seemed to love him, but you look around now and you think, my goodness, you know, these people, I don't think can attract and can mobilise people. So I think that's a big problem. So yeah.
Thanks, John. And you really sort of, I mean, from all of your contributions, but particularly what John was saying just then about leadership, it reminds us of the difference between a leader who really does have the class interests of their members front and center of what they do, because those types of leaders are able to stand up to the demonization in the media. Of course, they're going to get demonization precisely because they are standing up for workers. But if they are honest in what they're trying to do and they mean what they say, they will stand up against it. And that's what gets them the respect. That's why everybody loved Bob Crow. Number one, he did really represent his members and their class interests. Number two, when the media came for him and tried to shake him off that conviction, he didn't collapse. You know, he did the opposite. He stood up to it, and people respect that. workers like to see leaders they feel they can really put their faith and their trust in. Another leader who was like that when it came to trade union activism was, of course, Arthur Scargill. And when I was young, joined the Socialist Labour Party, which was the first kind of big kind of attempt to break that link between the Labour Party and the working class. And, you know, it didn't succeed. There was a lot of potential there. But one of the things that Arthur Scargill was really good on was this understanding of what was wrong with the trade union movement. And he had two slogans, which I still think are totally relevant today. One of them was break the link with Labour, stop that subservience of all interests of worker struggles to the electoral kind of fortunes of the Labour Party. And the other one was defy the anti-trade union laws. Now, all of you have talked already about the effect of the anti-union laws on the ability to organise and to struggle effectively. And of course, that's the reason they were enacted, right? They were enacted by a ruling class on the offensive, wanting to make it impossible for us to win our struggles. Now, this acceptance of the law as if it's something kind of almighty and holy that comes from God. In my years as a trade unionist, I got really tired of hearing leaderships talk about, it's the law, as if, oh, well, in that case, there's nothing we can do. And I always completely agreed with Arthur Scargill's approach that the way you overturn unjust laws is to defy them, to make them unworkable. But that means obviously having the kind of leadership that's prepared to say to its members, this is against the law, but this is also the only way to win. So my proposal is we do it anyway. And I'd like to know what you guys think about that, Paul.
I think there are some circumstances at the extreme where it may be necessary to say, look, we have to consider breaking the law on this. I think it should always be very much a last resort. I mean, I'm a believer in the principle of conscience before the law, but equally, I think you always have to try and take members with you, you know, whether those members are active radical members, whether they're more kind of moderate members. And I think when we advocate in the trade union movement breaking the law, we are opening up a big can of worms, and we need to be conscious of the fact that many workers will have issues over that and won't necessarily go with us. And the danger, I think, sometimes as well, is that you send a message, well, it's okay for us to do it, and consequently the people on the other side, whether they're employers or whatever, you know, opponents of the trade union movement generally, will say, well, if it's okay for you to do, we'll do it as well, you know, when it comes to the way we treat people in the workplace and so on. So my much preferred method is, you know, to win people to the argument. If you're campaigning for strike action, for better pay, better conditions or whatever, then, you know, run a proper campaign, get your members on board, do the meetings, win the ballot, take the strike action lawfully. That way, I think you're much more likely to keep members on board and you know, the general public on board. So as a last resort, where it is absolutely necessary and justified perhaps, but you know, I think there are a lot of steps usually before you get to that point. I mean, I do. As every speaker has said, I think, I mean, there has certainly been a kind of depoliticisation of the trade union movement and of trade union activists generally. I mean, I remember when I first joined the Fire Brigades Union in the late 1990s, you had very active groups, you know, the Socialist Workers' Party were quite active. You had people who came from the old Communist Party, obviously Labour Party activists and Socialist Alliance and so on. It's very rare, I think, in unions to see that degree of activity from political groups inside trade unions. And again, there's all sorts of reasons for that. I think the fact that we live in times where trade unions are not on the front pages of the newspapers, on the news bulletins as much as they were in the 1980s, for example. And I think the danger sometimes is that ordinary rank and file trade unionist workers just see trade unions almost as some sort of charity or as some organisation that's provided insurance services or discounts on holidays or, you know, whatever unions sometimes do. And all of that is fine, but the bread and butter stuff, defending people in terms of their pay and conditions in the workplace, I think is key. I mean, I say that I think what we probably need to do is need to kind of learn the lessons of the new unionism. You know, when those leaders, the likes of Ben Tillett and Will Thorne and Tom Mann and others, went out and, you know, saw that there were vast numbers of untapped labour out there. You know, most workers were not represented in trade unions. It was just more the kind of skilled workers, craft industries that were represented by trade unions at that time. And they, you know, built the trade union movement up and brought thousands, hundreds of thousands of members into the trade union movement. I think we need to relearn those lessons, to be honest, that actually there are vast numbers of workers, untapped labour out there that need and deserve trade union representation. We don't yet have a strategy for going and recruiting those people. And, you know, as I touched on before, that needs to be priority number one, I think.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And in particular, and again, it brings us back to a point you made earlier, but this situation creates the downward pressure on wages that affects everybody. You know, it's so incredibly short-sighted for any trade union to consider, you know, allowing divided conditions within a workplace or within, you know, the national workforce in general, because it all adds up to the same thing. If some people can be employed in terrible conditions, on terrible wages, you know, 0 hours and all the rest of it, sweatshops, then inevitably there will be a downward pull on the wages of everybody else. And our trade unions, I think, have been hugely complacent in the way that they have saved their efforts for protecting the pay and conditions of a small group of people who are relatively well paid and have relatively better conditions. And as you say, the large numbers of workers in totally kind of appalling conditions and what do you call that? Insecure work, gig economy, all of that. The fact that they've left that all on the side has inevitably affected everybody else. This is why the bosses are able to turn around to us and say, well, you guys are very well paid. What are you complaining about? And it's hard then for, you know, the nurses and the doctors and the firefighters to get the sympathy of the rest of the working class when they're trying to protect their pay and conditions, because actually they're better paid than so many others. And, you know, I remember having this argument in just about divided conditions within a single workplace, again, with my trade union when I was a unionist, and the bosses kind of saying to me, the trade union bosses, that is, well, what do you want us to do, Joti? Because our employer was introducing new conditions for new starters. And I was saying, we have to oppose this. I say, well, we can't represent people who aren't even our members yet. You know, they really did not want to have the fight. And they came up with all kinds of weasel words to justify not standing up for people. But actually, it was all of us that we were trying to defend, not just some future mythical people. Of course, very soon, those future new starters become the majority, don't they, with the turnover in the workplace. And then guess what? You people who are on the slightly better conditions, they're coming for you next. Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Paul said earlier on. The only thing I have a slight difference of opinion on is about the justification of industrial action in the event of a pursuit of pay or terms or conditions. I mean, there's two things I'd say about the anti-trade union laws. One is that trade union bureaucracies have hidden behind these trade union laws for quite a long time to avoid going into confrontation with management on all kinds of issues. But the second thing I'd say is that the trade union laws are incredibly technical. They have rules about how trade unions can spend their political funds, how often general secretaries have to be elected, rules on how many people can be on picket lines, thresholds for ballots and so on. But for me, the long and the short of it is, if there is a group of workers that want to improve their terms and conditions and they aren't getting the backing from their union, then they have to take whatever action they deem necessary, including things like Wildcat Strikes. And I remember on London Underground back in the late 80s, there were a series of Wildcat Strikes taking place over a dispute over pay and terms and conditions for train drivers. And even the managing director of London Underground went on Thames television and said, there is nothing I can do about this. And they said, well, can't you take them to court? He said, I can't take them to court because the union didn't ballot them. I'm absolutely helpless. We've just got to come to an agreement with these drivers one way or another. And this was after trade union laws, anti-trade union laws were put in place. So I believe, I understand what Paul's saying about possibly losing public sympathy. But if the act is just, if the action is just, if the motivations are right, you can get people on board. If all that makes that strike illegal is the fact that they haven't hit a threshold for a ballot, or the fact that not enough people voted in favour of it, or something like that. So I would always defend workers over the law when it comes to raising their terms and conditions, definitely.
How about you, John? Do you have a feeling either way on this?
No, I mean, I'm kind of on the fence, really. I mean, Jason said, I mean, obviously, there are parts of the anti-union laws which are just, kind of within half a yard of a line or something, and you're kind of breaking the law, sort of thing, or whatever. But I think what Paul said, I think, the thing, I mean, what we said in the first question, winning people to the argument, the depoliticisation, the rank and file, the sense is then that the unions have got to work a damn lot harder than what they are doing, to kind of to bring people with them, and obviously because there is a lot. I mean, I don't know what, I can't speak for the other panelists, but there's a sense in a fair few workplaces in a lot of union branches that, like Paul said, it's like the service model. They kind of wait for something to happen. They either wait for a holiday to come up with a discount or something, or they wait for, God forbid, they wait for, to get into some trouble at work, disciplinary action, and then they call on the union. So, and I think the unions are almost quite happy with that, because they're still getting their subs, and you might only need to represent that particular member, once every 3 or 4 years. So I think we do need to mobilise the rank and file. The unions need to do that, and because I think that this seems to just represent a failure in the service model, I think, which is, obviously doing down a lot of kind of political and trade union activism, I think.
We've talked about the fact that there's this disconnect between those who are in unions and the vast majority of the workforce now, which isn't in unions. But there's a disconnect, isn't there, as well, inside the unions, between the leaderships and the bureaucracy on the one hand, and the mass of the grassroots rank and file on the other. And Paul, where do you think that stems from?
I think it's probably similar to the phenomenon that has kind of taken over the Labour Party, where the party itself, I think, certainly at the upper levels initially, and more widely subsequently, has, over the course of, I would say, the last 3 decades, become much more kind of middle class in its demographic, much more urban based. It's retreated from, if you like, Britain beyond the cities, provincial Britain, the private sector, small town Britain, post-industrial Britain. And I think as the movement itself has become more middle class and become more of a movement, the Labour movement generally, for the professional and managerial classes, it's alienated, I think, many ordinary workers, many working class people who previously were drawn to the Labour Party, who would be drawn to the trade union movement, who now kind of see it and think, well, you don't really represent me, you don't really talk my language or share my priorities. I mean, I think the Brexit referendum was probably one of the most striking examples of that, where, it was largely, not exclusively, but largely a working class vote, the Leave vote. It was the working class vote, certainly, that pushed it over the line. And yet here were the leaders of the movement, the Labour Party and the trade union movement, who almost to a man and woman were lined up on the other side of the argument. A complete turnaround from 1975 in the Common Market referendum, where you had the majority of trade unions supporting no, huge numbers of Labour MPs supporting no, including some real big hitters. And it seems to me now that at the upper echelons of the movement, you kind of have the situation where people almost come through on this conveyor belt, whether they become MPs or senior kind of policy officers in the TUC or whatever. You know, they go to university, they spend a bit of time working for a think tank or a charity, or being a research assistant, and less are people coming up through the trade union movement and the Labour Party having worked in what you might call normal jobs and had working class backgrounds. And as that has changed, the whole kind of priority, the priorities of the movement have changed. And, you know, I think it was Jason who touched on the kind of obsession with ID politics, which in my view is hugely divisive and destructive. You know, this obsession with emphasising people's separateness and difference, and you know, and accentuating people's particular biological or religious characteristics, and then treating them as virtuous in themselves and counterposing them to other working people, and dismissing white working class people as having some sort of white privilege. And it seems to me to be the very opposite of what the trade union movement should be about, which should be building bridges between people, building unity between people, concentrating on what unites people, not constantly emphasising diversity and you know, the differences that exist between people. And this kind of obsession with ID politics has led us into some really weird places. I mean, I won't even touch on the trans debate because we could go on forever about that. But even something simple that I raised recently, you may have seen it, I raised it on social media about, I mean, I believe that the trade union movement, and I said that the trade union movement should move on from campaigning to campaigning for a living wage and move on to campaigning for a family wage, which is where, you know, a family can raise, you know, can subsist, and you can raise children on the basis of one wage earner. It seems to me to be a perfectly natural thing that the trade union movement should campaign for. You know, we shouldn't have a situation where if you've got two parents, for example, they should be compelled by economic imperative both to go out to work in order to survive, because that has huge implications for work-life balance, for childcare, for all of that sort of stuff. Now, I have no preferment over who that wage earner should be. I would be perfectly happy if in my household it was my wife who went out to work and earn a wage, and I would stay at home. But when I raised that, the criticism and the flack from elements within the trade union movement, including senior officials in the TUC, saying that this was an inherently sexist idea and Paul Embery wants to keep women chained to the kitchen sink, and you know, almost as if they were saying, no, we want women to go out and work in call centres for low wages just to prove that, you know, they can have economic independence and they don't have to stay at home. It seems to me to be a nonsense argument. You know, if the trade union movement thought it was possible to bring about an economy where families could survive with one wage earner's wage, seems to me to be perfectly reasonable to say, well, that's what we should campaign for. So to have elements of the movement saying, no, we want people to be forced to go out to work in order to survive, was absolutely bizarre. But that is where ID politics has led us, unfortunately. We've got away from the issues of class that Jason was touching on, and we've gone into some real cul-de-sacs, and I find it really disturbing.
Interesting, actually, the point you raised there, Paul, because of course, I had a comrade years ago who pointed out to me that, you know, when the ruling class makes concessions to us, so the demand for women's equality and women's liberty is essentially a socialist demand, because really it can't be fully realized until you get rid of class society. Under the conditions of capitalism, what has it meant? Exactly what you said, Paul. Under the conditions of capitalism, it said, okay, yes, women, you're free. You're free to work out of the home and in the home. Yay, you get to do them both. And now, in fact, you're going to have to do them both, because what's happened is the cost of living has become such that you need two wage earners to keep a roof over a family's head. So that has been the net result of the women's movement under conditions of capitalism. To me, the lesson is clearly we need socialism. But it's interesting that, you know, you should get so much pushback from really pointing out the downside of you know, what has happened in the last period. Yes, our wages do not, one person's wage can't keep a family going unless you're really, really lucky. And it's, you know, I was just listening to what you were saying there about the sort of professionalization of the leadership of the Labour Party and of the trade union movement. And really, I think what we're seeing is this a real big retreat in the face of ruling class ideology. You know, in the our movement, our class has conceded, our leadership have conceded to liberalism, to individualism, to identity politics, to the politics of division and individual, which is the exact opposite of the politics of the working class. The politics of the working class is the politics of community, the politics of solidarity, the politics of unity, because of course that is where our strength is. Of course, our philosophy has to be one, is socialism, because that is the answer to the liberation of our class. Of course, our politics is about bringing us together, because that is the only source of strength for us. We don't have the power, we don't have the money, we don't have the arms of the state in our hands. We have the numbers, we have the muscle. We only harness that when we organize together. And so the working class has to cling on to the politics of community, of socialism, of unity, of collectivism. But this beheading of our movement and replacing of conviction politicians with careerists, people who there's a gravy train that people have identified. It's a career option. Go to university, get the right placement, do the right internship. You know, just as if you would join the law or join medicine or become an accountant or, you know, become some kind of a politician or working class leader, misleader. You know, it's become something for graduates to do as a job, as opposed to a conviction position. And exactly why, you know, we see the big difference. Jason, you were talking earlier about, you know, people that you recognize and the love that people had, or John, you were saying, was it about Bob Crow and the love that people had for him, because he clearly was a conviction activist and leader and politician, and not a career one. He quite clearly wasn't in it for the money, right? And it seems to me that that's something that we really need to be looking at. If we want our unions to be fighting organizations, they need to be led by conviction politicians, not career politicians. Jason.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, the changing the demographic of the staff, the regional organisers, the people who run our trade unions has changed dramatically in the last 20 years or so. It depends on what union you're in. Some have different methods by which people like regional organisers are posted. Sometimes they're employed through a selection process, sometimes they're elected. But the long and the short of it is that I have noticed, especially over the last 20 years, a real disconnect between what workers are saying in their workplaces on the ground and what the paid staff of unions are being given to do. There seems to be they're two separate spinning plates that have absolutely no connection whatsoever. And you know, not to do down people who've come into the trade union movement from university, but going through university gives you certain values and certain perspectives that perhaps working class people don't share. Paul touched briefly on trans, and again, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. We haven't got enough time, but it's issues like that. There's a disconnect between people who come from university. Not all, of course. I'm not tarring everyone with the same brush, but there's people who come from a certain background, carry certain values, especially in terms of liberal politics. You know, you mentioned earlier about encouraging women into the workplace as some sort of liberal capitalist move, and it was because it just gives you another layer of people to exploit. It's just the same as when you get rid of the retirement age, you're just giving yourself another layer of people to exploit. That's how capitalism works. It works by exploiting people regardless of where they are in the career line, how old they are, what sex they are, or anything else. As long as you're available to work, capitalism wants to exploit you. But it's that disconnect. And I think that the other point I'd make as well is that there seems to be a deficit of democracy in trade unions. And it's not because the structures in the trade unions aren't democratic. It's because there's a deficit of interest amongst workers to get more involved in their trade unions. So to become executive committee members, for instance, and I remember from my own experience, we had terrible trouble finding people who are interested in becoming executive committee members, partly because they don't understand fully what it involves. Secondly, they don't want to commit the time, or they can't commit the time. And thirdly, they always think someone else is going to do it. And it's always about, for me, it's if we had this class consciousness at the bottom, and if we got people to develop a political consciousness, then we would have people who would be ready and willing to ascend to the executive levels of trade unions, rather than sit at the bottom and pay their subs and then call their union when they get into trouble.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jason. John?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that definitely there's a disconnect. I also think that the unions, particularly over the last 10 or so years, particularly when unemployment was rather high, I think they missed the trick about, we're talking about, getting involved in communities and stuff. I think unions getting involved with unemployed sections of the working class would have been probably the starting point. Because I don't think, we were kind of talking about before, unions shouldn't just be there as an insurance or just for when people are working. I think unions should be on the ground working within communities. And then I think the disconnect that we're talking about, the ID politics, let's call people by the proper pronouns and stuff. That stuff, if unions were involved in their communities, that stuff wouldn't even be coming up, because that is not what people, if you went and knocked on your next door neighbour's house, that is not what they would be talking about. As Paul said, this is just a liberal university, middle class educated topic that kind of gets their blood flowing. Probably they enjoy it, but it's not actually in the interests of the working class. So I think that the solution is, the take home message, I think, is that the unions need to be embedded in their communities, just like the Labour Party. And I think Paul's right talking about, there's a similarity, isn't there, between the collapse, if you like, or the retreat, as we called it, of the trade unions, and the collapse and retreat of the Labour Party. And it seems to be because of that kind of disconnect between ordinary people.
So, I mean, when I look at the situation, I really feel like, we know that the Labour Party was originally founded by trade unionists, but it was founded by a certain type of trade unionist. It was founded precisely by the ones that Paul talked about earlier, the kind of elite original trade unionists who formed quite a privileged section in the working class. It wasn't founded by the new unionists, who tended to be much more radical, much more socialist, come from the poorer ranks of the working class. And the Labour Party has always, ever since its inception, been a party that represented the interests of that. It appealed to the mass of the workers, but it represented really the interests of the privileged sections. How those privileged sections look and act and come across has changed. Now they come across as very kind of more intellectual, what we would call middle class. What we really mean is university educated, privileged workers. And academia has really pushed identity politics and individualist ideology into the heads of our young people when they go to university. It's almost impossible to escape it once you get to kind of A levels and beyond in our education system now. But our trade unions, and particularly after the Second World War, they basically, it's really the socialist elements within the unions, the radical section, allowed itself to give up on the idea of the class struggle, allowed itself to buy into an idea that was always a lie, that we were going to progress to socialism through parliamentary means and through the Labour Party. And if you look at the history of the last 70 years, what you see is, with this idea, they really lulled the working class to sleep. We used to have big militant sections of the working class that were constantly putting pressure inside the unions, on the Labour Party from the outside, in society, through their own organisations. The communists organised the National Unemployed Workers Movement. and all kinds of things that really exposed what was going on in our society, and kept the militant section of the workers kind of conscious of the class struggle and engaged in it. But when they tied themselves to the Labour Party and to elections as the way to improve things for workers after the Second World War, I think that's really the beginning of the rot that we've seen, because they let go of what you were talking about, Jason, this class analysis. They accepted the idea that the state, the laws, and the democracy that we live under are neutral and not class aligned. And that's exactly the opposite of what a class understanding of society teaches you. And now, of course, we're in this situation where we've got a desperate lack of class consciousness. There's a lack of basic awareness amongst workers of where wealth comes from. We buy into what the media tells us about wealth creators. We're the wealth creators. It's the working class that creates all the wealth, not the rich. But we're told that we have to worry about what the rich are going to do if we want jobs and we want wealth. We've got this total lack of understanding of the opposing interests between the workers and the capitalists. We're told that if things are good for capital, then they'll be good for us. It's absolutely the opposite is the case. But, we don't have strong organizations that are explaining these things to workers and keeping them kind of alert to what's going on. We've got a total lack of understanding of the relationship between profits and wages. Again, we're sort of told, oh, if profits are high, you might get better wages. No, if we fight for better wages, profits will go down. If they push back against our wages, their profits will go up. There's an inverse relationship between profits and wages. And that's a basic lesson that workers should understand so that we can withstand, the onslaught of propaganda from our ruling class, which is overwhelming if we don't have the tools to stand up for it. But just some very simple lessons in class consciousness can enable us to stand up to it, because our experience tells us that there's a lot of what we're seeing isn't true. And I guess I wanted to come on to that now, really. My own feeling is that despite the very low ebb that our movement has come to, our low levels of class consciousness, our low levels of organization, it seems to me actually that the tide is beginning to turn. We have seen real outbursts of working class anger in the last decade. We saw the student uprisings right in the beginning of all kind of austerity time. We saw the youth uprising of 2011, which really shocked a lot of people, the kind of explosion of anger onto the streets of young people who'd been really left behind. The Brexit vote, of course, in 2016 and everything that's come after that. We've seen a real kind of steady erosion of faith in the institutions of British democracy, of faith in parliament and politicians, faith in media and journalists, in the police and the judiciary, all of those institutions that hold up this capitalist society have been undermined in the eyes of the mass of the working class. And the pandemic really deepened the awareness of that, of the gulf in our society between the poor and the rich. It's really increased the anger over all the injustices and the inequalities in our society. And to me, it seems there are increasing signs that the working class is not going to stay on its knees forever. One way or another, it's going to work out a way to fight back. So what I'd really like to kind of round up with is to ask you guys, is there anything in the situation right now that gives you hope for advance? Paul?
I think it was Gramsci who said pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, wasn't it? I mean, look, there have been some very seismic shifts over the last few years. I mean, the EU referendum, I think, was a genuine democratic revolt in this country by ordinary voters, many of them, millions of them, working class voters, many of whom voted for the first time and really wanted to shake up the system and to send a missile through the status quo. And they certainly did that, despite the fact that the institutions of workers, the Labour Party and the trade union movement were telling them not to do it. And, some part that might well be why they did do it, particularly when, also the banking industry and big business, the CBI, the Tory government and others were telling them not to vote leave as well. In many respects, the 2019 general election was a carryover from that, I think. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's very disappointing that workers in constituencies that have voted Labour since time immemorial voted Tory, but you can understand why they abandoned the Labour Party, because they felt that the Labour Party had abandoned them. So there is definitely, I think, the beginnings. Well, I say the beginnings. It's been going on for a few years now. Of a real anger out there, but I think it's a very sort of inchoate and disjointed anger at the moment. It isn't being harnessed through the trade union movement particularly, it isn't being harnessed through the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, and it's kind of trying to, I think, find its space, but it isn't going away, and people in our political institutions, the political class, are being forced to sit up and listen to it, I think. So there's certainly an audience, I think, for some of the stuff that we've argued during this meeting, and that we've argued beyond this meeting. I think the problem is trying to ensure that the trade union movement and the institutions of the labour movement are able to harness that anger. I am not confident, I have to say, that they've diagnosed the problem. I still think there are large elements of the labour movement that have diagnosed the problem completely incorrectly. They think that the reason that the Labour Party is flirting with electoral irrelevance is because there was a hostile media towards Jeremy Corbyn, or because it's all attributable to the Brexit campaign, or because of plotters and backstabbers in the Labour Party. I think that's to misread the situation. You know, this disconnect between working people and the labour movement has been going on for many, many years, well before Jeremy Corbyn came to power. So the anger's there, and the potential is there to harness that anger, but at the moment the trade union movement doesn't look like it's got a strategy to do that. That's my honest assessment of the situation.
Definitely, thanks, Paul. Jason.
Yeah, it's very difficult, and I've said this before. It's very difficult to have a discussion about trade unions without getting into a very depressing state, because I think the working class and the trade union movement have been in a state of defeat for about 35 years now. But what I would say is I'm starting to see some shoots of recovery. I'm starting to see some green shoots of recovery. I'm looking at Unite in particular. And Unite recently, as you know, changed their general secretary. Sharon Graham was elected as GS, and I was initially skeptical. I didn't think it would make any difference, but I have to say I've been very impressed with Sharon's approach to the position. Much in the Bob Crow mould, which is to put members first, above any political machinations in the Labour Party or trying to influence policy there, but actually doing the bread and butter work that general secretaries are paid handsomely to do, which is to represent their members and work in the interest of their members, like Bob Crow did. Bob Crow was always, I was lucky enough to know Bob because he was in my branch, my union branch many years ago, and he was 100% centred around the needs of the members, and everything else was secondary. I have to say it only seems to be Unite leading the way on this at the moment, and I hope that other unions follow suit. But I'm encouraged by the way Unite are approaching things, because they're getting some good wins for their members, particularly in buses, and they're fighting very strenuously against the fire and rehire tactics at Weetabix as well, which is making the headlines as well. So I am encouraged by what's going on. I do agree, however, with Paul. I don't think the unions quite understand the issues that they're having to tackle. But I am encouraged by some of the actions that they're taking in actually doing what they're there to do, which is to represent their members.
Brilliant. John.
Yeah, there is a lot of, I think, you know, I mean, it's the hope. I mean, I think the fact there'll be a lot of anger out there with, you know, CPI being at 6%, the pandemic, etc. You know, that there's anger there, which ought to be hope for the rest of us. You know, hope to engineer, manufacture, change. I think if you look at, 40 miles across the coast in France with the Gilets jaunes movement, and you know that's they're showing us how it's done, aren't they? You know, that's what we need to do. I also think, you know, that we were talking before about the unions need to be in touch with communities and stuff. I can't believe, I don't think they would now, but you know, the rising cost of, I don't know if anyone's tried to fuel up their car recently. You know, like 150, 155 a litre for diesel. But I was thinking the other day, no trade union leader or any Labour figure, Labour MP would ever dare say, God, the diesel's so expensive, because there's an obsession, like we've talked about with identity politics and liberalism and stuff. It's kind of filtered into this kind of green politics as well, isn't it? The kind of need to, you need to walk 40 miles to work instead of using your car because, you need to save the polar bears and stuff like that. So I think that is the hope, that the unions harness this anger. We know it can be done. It's been done elsewhere. And as Jason said, and what Paul said with Brexit, with new figures coming in that perhaps aren't as interlocked with the Labour Party and are more focused on the members, and the fact that the members aren't, I think the rank and file, I think everyone would agree, the rank and file aren't interested in, still to this day, 5 years later, rejoining the European Union or having another referendum or trans rights or, painting a zebra cross in a different colour because that's what, we should do. That's what that'll come from the rank and file. And I think if the unions don't know it already that they're out of touch, then I think very soon they will. And that is the rosy, positive message to finish on, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, when I look at the situation now, I have to say I see a lot of hope, actually, because for a start, the biggest obstacle, to my mind, between the working class in this country and meaningful progress towards socialism has been the Labour Party. And right now, the Labour Party's future is in doubt. I would say its future really is in the past. Its connections to the mass of the poor working class are really crumbling hand over fist, if there's any left at all. And they've really been exposed as the party of the war, as the party of big business, as a party that has no interest in taking care of the needs and requirements of ordinary working class people, and it's precisely in the red wall places, the places where, like Hillary Clinton called them basket of deplorables over her side of the Atlantic, where it was thought that workers had no choice but to keep voting Labour, where they'd had Labour councils and Labour MPs for decades, and those councillors, MPs had done nothing for them as their jobs disappeared and their lives got worse and their housing disappeared and all their community facilities disappeared. And, you didn't have an MP or a councillor leading a sit-in for a library, never mind to save a factory. They're all focused on taking care of themselves and taking care of the interests of the financiers. And this has become clear to people. And for me, that is a great step forward. That is a step towards where we need to be. They've broken the bonds that said, or Labour Party is kind of a religion for the working class, and you stick with it no matter what. It's your football team, it's your side. You wear your red scarf and you go out and vote Labour, and that's your job as a worker. To break that shibboleth, I think, is a massive step forward. And I don't feel scared when I see workers voting Tory, because having moved their vote once, they can move it again much more easily. It was the shibboleth that said, must be Labour. My father was, my grandfather was, it's our tradition, we're working class. It was breaking that was so hard and took so long, so much evidence needed for people before they finally did it, and Brexit wasn't the reason, it was just the last straw. And personally, I'm happy to see that change come about. I'm, of course, happy to see the formation of the Workers' Party. We hope very much to break this identification of the word left with liberals and lifestylists. I mean, perhaps we just need to forget about identifying as left at all. But what we do want to do is go to the working class and say, we're socialists because we fight for the working class. And that's what socialism is. Socialism is the future of the working class. And we want to reclaim working class politics for socialism. Because that is the only way out of the problems that beset workers on every side. And we have to recognize our strength is in numbers. We need to help our class regain that understanding, organize to harness their strength and demand their rights. We are the producers of all of society's wealth. And you're right, Jason, talking today about unions and with trade unionists, and it has been for the last 30 years, is depressing. people who give their lives to trade unionism can get, steadily more depressed and defeated in the current climate. But the working class is in desperate need of meaningful organisation. So I guess the last question I want to leave you guys on very briefly is, do you think we are going to be able to reform our current trade unions, or are we going to end up having to form new ones? Because one way or another, the working class is going to find its way out of this mess. It is going to find a way to organise itself. Do you have a feeling about how that's going to happen? John?
I think new ones, yeah. I think I appreciate the. I'm in Unite, and obviously they've changed the general secretary, and I appreciate there's things things are better, but I still think kind of what we've touched about throughout the whole session, really, that these unions now have way too much baggage and way too much additional kind of things going on in the background which don't concern or interest ordinary working people. And I think for that there will be a need to either have new unions coexist with the current ones. I mean, I always say and always think, that there are always, spaces open for new unions and particularly, specialised unions. The RMT, I think, was so successful. We talked about them before because they were focused on, the train drivers, transport workers. And I think Paul might have touched on this in his book, perhaps, or I think it might have been you, Joti, that's talked about these super unions. These unions become so big and so kind of, and obviously they've done it for different reasons, for financial and for operational ease. But without doubt, I think the more bureaucratic, the more super unions are, the more bigger they are, the more bureaucratic they are. So I think potentially there needs to be new unions to either replace the old ones or to coexist.
Paul?
Well, I'm more in favour of a kind of culture change, really, within the existing institutions of the Labour movement. I mean, look, I'm a Labour Party member. I still think that the Labour Party is the best vehicle by which the working class in this country can advance their interests, though I'm under no illusions at the moment how difficult that is. I'm under no illusions. I've written and spoken extensively about it, about the disconnect that exists between the Labour Party and the trade union movement and working class people at the moment. But I don't really see the salvation coming from elsewhere, and that may be partly because of the nature of the two-party system that we live in. And I think it needs to be said that the Labour Party has, whatever its faults, certainly delivered some real advances for working class people throughout its history, whether it's the National Health Service, the welfare state, council housing, minimum wage, trade union rights, etc. But what I think is that until, as I said, there's a culture change, a change in the DNA of the movement, a sort of overhaul of its ideology, where it starts speaking the language and sharing the priorities of ordinary working class people more. Then I think that just setting up new unions is not necessarily going to solve that, because it would probably still be largely the same sort of activists and leaders and whatever involved. People sometimes have a bash at it. I know there's been breakaway unions, and some of them have kind of fared okay and done some really good work. But I think we need to focus on winning the political debate with people and shifting the whole culture and ideology of the movement. That's the main battle for me.
Thanks, Paul. Jason, last word to you.
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion that Remain and Reform is a little bit of a dead end. I think it was a dead end when we were talking about the European Union. My personal view is that it's a dead end with regards to the Labour Party, and I think it might be something of a dead end in the trade union movement. I think when workers have to, they will do the most pragmatic and most effective thing for themselves. If that means setting up their own union, then that's what they'll have to do. It's in fact, it's something I asked Paul a while ago when we done the interview for the Workers' Party about why was it in a country where we have a union for musicians, we have a union for train drivers, we have a union for firefighters, and yet there is this huge strata of workers who have no union to go to, either because they don't believe a union represents their particular interests as transient workers, people who are in the slightly more fluid end of the workforce, or because the unions aren't interested in taking them on. And that's why they ended up establishing their own unions, like the Independent Workers of Great Britain, like United Voices of the World. And I think where pushed, working class people will do what they have to do. And if it means setting up a union, which is difficult, it's not an easy undertaking, it's not something you could do overnight. But if it's something that they have to do, then that's something that they will do.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to leave it there. I want to thank all of my guests for a really excellent, interesting discussion. Thank you to our listeners, and we'll see you again very soon.